When we hear the word idiot, we usually think of someone clumsy, not very intelligent, or incapable of understanding the world. However, in Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot, something much more disturbing happens. Here, the idiot is not a fool, but a human figure who does not fit into the dominant way of living, thinking, and relating. This video does not talk about a pathology or simple naivety, but rather about a type of person who is uncomfortable for a society obsessed with utility, visible success, and constant calculation. Understanding why Prince Myshkin receives this name requires a brief historical and philosophical digression, because within that word lies a central question of modernity. What place remains for kindness, compassion, and truth in a world that values, above all, what produces immediate results? To understand this, it is helpful to go back to the origin of the term. In classical Greek, idiots did not refer to someone lacking intelligence, but to the particular, the one who did not participate in public life or the affairs of the polis. It was not a mental insult, but a political and social description. The one who did not enter the common game of prestige, power, and recognition. Over time, that figure who did not participate began to seem suspicious. If someone did not compete, did not seek position or influence, then they must have been incapable, immature, or useless. Dostoevsky picks up this shift in meaning to construct Myshkin, a man who does not participate in the utilitarian social order, and precisely for that reason is perceived as deficient, even though his flaw is of a different nature. The society surrounding Myshkin operates according to a rationality that we would now call instrumental. In it, rational does not mean just or true, but effective. It is rational to arrange a good marriage, rise socially, protect one's reputation, secure income, and know how to navigate intrigue. A good subject is the one who calculates well, measures consequences, hides what is convenient, controls their emotions, and adjusts their words to their interests. Myshkin does exactly the opposite. He says what he thinks, shows compassion when coldness would be expected, gives money when prudence would dictate keeping it, and lets himself be affected by others' suffering when the smart thing to do would be to look the other way. This misalignment makes him, in the eyes of others, an idiot in the modern sense, someone who does not know how to live. To understand why this label is unjust, it is helpful to distinguish between two types of rationality. Technical rationality is the ability to choose the best means to a given end, how to make more money, how to influence someone, how to maintain a good image. It is the rationality of the strategist and the manager. Moral rationality, on the other hand, asks about the very goals themselves. It not only asks how, but also for what and at what cost. In the novel, almost all the characters are experts in technical rationality. They know how to maneuver, pressure, and conceal. Myshkin, however, is guided by moral rationality. He first considers the dignity of people, the truth of the situation, and the suffering involved. This makes him clumsy in the realm of maneuvering, but extraordinarily clear-sighted in the essentials. This contrast becomes evident in his relationship with money, honor, and love. Where others see opportunities, he sees specific people. He does not calculate what is convenient for him, but what seems humane. When he intervenes in public humiliations or defends someone despised, he does so guided by a moral logic that overrides social prudence. It is not that he does not think of the consequences, but that he thinks about them differently. He cares more about the consequences for the soul of those involved than for their social standing. The tragedy is that a society governed by instrumental rationality interprets this way of thinking as incapacity, failing to notice that perhaps the real problem is not with Myshkin, but with the world that does not know what to do with someone like him. This initial discomfort is not a minor detail, but the key that will allow us to understand everything that follows, because the fate of the idiot reveals the moral cracks of the society that surrounds him entirely. Linked to this moral rationality is another decisive trait of the idiot: hypersensitivity. Myshkin does not perceive less than others, but more. He is an epileptic who lives with his consciousness always on the verge of crisis, and this physical fragility is combined with extraordinary sensitivity. He picks up nuances in faces, small changes in tone of voice, silences filled with pain. Where others see a scandal or gossip, he perceives a wound. This hypersensitivity is not simple, uncontrolled emotionality. It is an expanded form of perception, a finer antenna, but also more exposed, Around him, the novel suggests an atmosphere in which something absolute is felt, as if through this sensitivity, a presence exceeding the merely human were filtering through. This expanded perception comes at a cost: suffering. The more one sees, the more painful it is to witness. Myshkin suffers not so much because of his personal problems, but because of the inability of others to love well, to speak the truth, to stop hurting each other. His body reacts with crises, his mind grows weary, his spirit overflows. The suffering here does not arise from a cognitive defect, but from an excess of consciousness. A consciousness that cannot anesthetize itself in the face of daily cruelty, humiliation, cynicism. What for others is social normality, for him is intolerable. And this moral intolerance gradually breaks him. We can see this in his relationship with Nastasia Philippovna and Aglaya. Most of the men in the novel choose based on pride, desire, or calculation. Myshkin, on the other hand, simultaneously sees Nastasia's humiliation, guilt, the need to be recognized, and Aglaya's proud purity, idealism, and fear. He cannot reduce them to choices in a love triangle. He sees them as two complex human destinies, equally requiring care. This perspective paralyzes him. He does not know how to decide as one does in a game of interests, because his moral perception does not allow him to sacrifice one to save the other. His tragedy is that of the one who feels too much to simplify others, and thus ends up letting events drag him along. Here appears the clash with what we could call the modern emotional economy. Our culture treats emotions as resources that must be managed efficiently. They must be regulated to perform well at work, to maintain functional relationships, to avoid bothering others or becoming vulnerable. The ability to not take things too personally, to be professional, to turn the page quickly is valued. In this framework, those who feel too much are seen as a problem. They consume energy, complicate decisions, slow down processes. They are encouraged to work on their emotions, primarily to better adapt to the system, not to question it. Myshkin embodies the opposite. Someone for whom feeling, understanding, and empathizing is not a luxury or a weakness, but the core of human life. The novel almost prophetically shows how a society that only recognizes instrumental rationality tends to pathologize this type of person. Myshkin is sent to sanatoriums, looked at condescendingly, diagnosed as naive, hysterical, sick. What the community cannot tolerate is not his lack of intelligence, but his inability to play by the rules of shared cynicism. It is as if society were saying, either you learn to enjoy the power games or you're out. And being out for this type of person means being crushed by a reality that does not know how to protect those who do not defend themselves. From this perspective, Dostoevsky's idiot is not a deficit, but a type of human being incompatible with the dominant instrumental rationality. He is someone whose reason is oriented toward the moral rather than the useful, whose sensitivity perceives more than is convenient to see, and whose suffering arises from this emotional clarity. The grim warning left by the first contact with Myshkin is clear. In a world governed only by efficiency, radical compassion, and an overly awake consciousness become dangerous. Saying that the idiot does not hierarchize pain means that it does not organize the suffering of others on a scale of importance, where some pains deserve attention and others are considered trivial or dispensable. Most of the characters in the novel do this without thinking. The pain of a socially committed woman weighs more than that of a servant. The drama of someone with a prestigious surname matters more than the anguish of a young person without status. Myshkin, on the other hand, reacts with the same seriousness to a fit of jealousy, a public humiliation, or the despair of a terminally ill person. He does not calculate, this is a minor thing, not worth getting involved in. His compassion has no official scales. This does not mean that he does not distinguish between more and less serious situations, but that he does not use them to justify indifference. In the usual logic, one might say, with so many problems in the world, I won't worry about this. It is a form of self-defense, but also a way of no longer seeing the other as someone irreplaceable. Myshkin does the opposite. Every concrete suffering is imposed on him as something absolute. Hippolyte's suicide attempt, Nastasia Philippovna's degradation, the shame of someone ridiculed in public, all of it moves him as though no possible hierarchy could relativize it. For him, a small humiliation does not exist. It is a destruction of dignity, and that is enough. If we translate this to our society, it becomes understandable why such a character would be uncomfortable. We live in a culture that systematically hierarchizes pain, the pain that makes it to the media, the one with an epic story, the one that fits with our political positions or our sensitivities. Other sufferings are relegated to collateral damage, personal problems, or people who asked for it. The subject who does not accept this hierarchy, who reacts with the same seriousness to bullying in a classroom as to a distant tragedy, breaks the tacit consensus that protects our peace of mind. The idiot is, in that sense, a consciousness that refuses to manage compassion according to the social value of those who suffer. The second key trait is that he does not reduce the other to function. In social life, almost without realizing it, we tend to see people as pieces that fulfill a role: partner, rival, lover, useful contact, subordinate, entertainment. This is not pure malice, it is a way of simplifying a complex world. But this simplification comes at a cost. The other becomes a means to our ends, a function in our life project. In the novel, many characters relate to others in this way. They approach someone for their money, surname, the reputation they carry, the possibility of scandal or social ascent. They see possibilities, not people. Myshkin cannot operate this way. He does not see Nastasia as the fallen one, nor Aglaia as the promising one, nor Rogozhin as the rival. Although society reads them that way, he sees them as fragile existences, marked by guilt, pride, fear, and the desire to be loved. This integral gaze disarms him in the realm of strategy. He does not know how to use anyone. When he could take advantage of a situation to gain influence, he stops because he sees the harm that could cause the other person. When offered a place in power games, he does not join because he senses the violence those games exert on those who become mere pieces. In the current world, this inability to reduce the other to function seems almost impractical. In business, a colleague is a human resource or an internal competitor. On social media, the other is a follower, a like, a hater. That is, a function within one's own visibility device. Even in intimate life, the relationship sometimes degrades to the question, what does this person bring to me? The idiot, in the Dostoevskyan sense, stands outside of this logic. He relates to people as ends in themselves, which prevents him from doing what is socially considered smart, sacrificing one to gain something from another, managing people as capital. From this follows an impossibility of emotional neutrality. Myshkin cannot place himself in the position of the cold, impartial observer who views intense human situations as if they were an interesting theater. Emotional neutrality is the ability to maintain emotional distance, to see, analyze, and decide without becoming overly involved. It is a skill highly valued in our institutions. Doctors, judges, bosses, teachers, journalists are all expected not to mix feelings with their tasks. But in Myshkin, there is a radical resistance to that separation. If he witnesses a humiliation, he intervenes. If someone suffers, he is affected. If an injustice arises, he cannot simply describe it. This does not mean that he is incapable of thinking clearly. On the contrary, many times he sees with lucidity what is happening. But his understanding and his feeling cannot be separated. When he understands the violence of a situation, his body and spirit react, sometimes to the point of crisis. This lack of armor makes him vulnerable to manipulation attempts, but it also allows him to reach places where others cannot. He recognizes pain that others do not even admit to themselves, perceives the hidden guilt beneath cynicism, detects tenderness beneath aggression. The price is high. He always lives on the edge of an emotional overflow that the environment interprets as weakness or illness. Ultimately, all of this leads to what we might call the lived absurd, not the theorized absurd. The absurd, in simple terms, is the experience that the world does not respond to our expectations of meaning and justice. Good is done, and evil happens. The truth is spoken, and contempt is received, love is given, and rejection is received. Later philosophers theorized this absurdity. Myshkin embodies it. He does not write treatises or develop systems. He simply lives again and again the contradiction between his deep impulse toward good and the cruel or indifferent response of the environment. Every time he acts out of compassion, and that triggers new intrigues. Every time his sincerity exposes the moral misery of others and provokes violence. The absurd becomes more intense for him. He cannot understand why the act of humbling himself to ask for forgiveness triggers aggression, why the offer of forgiveness is received as an insult, why purity of intention produces suspicion. The world around him is built on false balances that his presence destabilizes. His goodness functions as an unrelenting mirror. When others encounter it, they feel shame, anger, and a desire to destroy what exposes them. Myshkin and non-functional goodness. In a competitive social system, radical goodness does not fit. It is a structural anomaly. Most connections are organized around interests, reputation, exchange, and calculation. In this context, Prince Myshkin appears as something the system does not know how to process. A man who does good without strategy, without a hidden agenda, without using goodness as a bargaining chip. His presence is not only strange, it quietly disrupts the rules of the game. Myshkin is a figure of goodness without strategy, because his gestures are not aimed at gaining future benefits. He does not behave well to win others over, to cleanse his image, or to build a position. When he defends someone humiliated, when he interrupts cruelty, when he offers financial or emotional help, he does not ask how it will affect his reputation or what gain he will get. He acts because he considers it the right thing to do at that moment, even if it worsens his social or emotional situation. From the outside, this way of acting appears as naivety or clumsiness. From the inside, it is moral consistency. Here it is important to differentiate between moral goodness and effective goodness. Moral goodness is the commitment to doing good for its own sake, doing the right thing even when it is difficult, even when no one sees it, even when it does not improve one's image. It is an internal orientation. The person measures themselves by their fidelity to certain values, not by the response they get. Effective goodness, on the other hand, is the use of good gestures as tools for other purposes. Prestige, influence, peace of mind, personal marketing. The action may be the same, but the logic is different. It matters that it works, that it generates symbolic or material return. In the novel, almost all the characters understand goodness in an effective way. Generosity is used to buy wills, calm consciences, forge alliances, and settle debts. It is considered reasonable to be good as long as it does not compromise one's own interests too much. Myshkin breaks this pattern. He does not use goodness to negotiate. This is why his behavior confuses others. When he forgives the unforgivable, when he exposes himself for someone socially lost, when he trusts people everyone considers dangerous, he seems to be sabotaging his own life. From the system's logic, it is irrational. From the logic of moral goodness, it is the only possible consistency. In our competitive societies, we see this tension every day. Companies are expected to be responsible, but in a way that is compatible with profit. People are encouraged to be supportive, but without affecting their careers too much. Acts of help are communicated on social networks, integrated into resumes, and become a sign of value. This is not necessarily false or hypocritical, but it reveals something. Goodness is integrated into the system as a resource. The contemporary Myshkin, someone who donates quietly, forgives without turning it into a story, who renounces an unfair advantage without announcing it, appears as an odd case, almost suspicious. Another key feature of this anomaly is compassion without the expectation of reciprocity. To feel compassion in the deep sense is to be affected by another's pain and act accordingly, even though that other person may not be able to give anything in return. Myshkin allows himself to be carried away again and again by the misfortune of others without asking for guarantees. He does not demand gratitude, future loyalty, or assured change in behavior. He helps those who will likely reject him later, approaches those who can harm him, and stays by the side of people who do not promise to improve. In contrast, the dominant social logic tends to operate with an implicit contract. I help you, but I expect something from you. Not necessarily money or concrete favors, but recognition, respect, and consistency. If the other does not respond as we expect, we feel cheated. This is why compassion without reciprocity seems, from that logic, like self-deception. Myshkin is judged as someone who does not learn, who does not set boundaries, who does not take care of himself. But in his way of feeling, the value of the gesture does not depend on the result or the response. It depends on the suffering he sees in front of him at that moment. This type of compassion clashes with how many relationships are organized in a competitive system. Networks of contacts, for example, function as relational capital. Time and energy are invested where there may be a return. Myshkin's compassion, on the other hand, does not select based on future utility. This makes him less efficient, but also gives him a freedom that others do not have. He can move toward those everyone avoids because he is not calculating the profitability of his affections. There is an even more radical point, his inability to judge in the sense of condemning. Myshkin discerns evil, sees injustice, suffers cruelty. He is not blind, but it is almost impossible for him to fix someone in the category of bad, definitively. He always sees a crack, a wound, a human motive behind the behavior. Even in the face of destructive characters, he maintains a kind of openness. He recognizes their responsibility but does not deny them the possibility of change, nor does he reduce them to their worst act. He does not absorb the logic of, "this one is already lost." This inability to judge is a profound rupture of the symbolic order. Every society organizes itself by creating boundaries: who is respectable and who is not, who is guilty and who is a victim, who belongs and who is left out. These boundaries may be unjust, but they serve a function. They provide a sense of stability and control. Knowing who the bad ones are allows people to unload their anger onto them, feeling that the rest are relatively safe. When someone appears who refuses to close these categories, who refuses to hate cleanly, who refuses to reduce anyone to pure moral trash, it dismantles that mechanism. That is why Myshkin's radical goodness is not just a private trait, it is a structural anomaly. It questions the system of rewards and punishments, prestige and disrepute that upholds competitive social life. If the figure of the absolute guilty cannot be stabilized, if someone insists on remembering their human dimension, the shared hatred loses its unifying function. The community is left without an exterior upon which to project its own violence. Sincerity becomes antisocial when it crosses these tacit rules. For example, when someone humiliates another, the implicit code orders people to look the other way or downplay it. Myshkin, on the other hand, names the gesture as cruel, points it out, takes the side of the humiliated. He does not hide behind the formula, "it's not my business." His frankness does not consist of voicing hurtful opinions, but in refusing to participate in the theater. He says aloud what everyone feels but prefers not to say. This does not unite the community. It makes them uncomfortable because it forces them to see themselves as they truly are. In our societies, something similar happens. We claim to value authenticity, but only to a certain point. A person who is too sincere, who points out injustices in their workplace, who does not go along with cruel jokes, who questions gossip or mockery, is quickly labeled as difficult, intense, or maladjusted. Their sincerity exposes normalized violence. Myshkin, in this sense, is not an ethereal saint, but the figure of someone who has not learned the art of silencing what everyone knows and no one wants to hear. This sincerity is tied to a goodness understood as total exposure. Myshkin does not protect himself. He does not hide his emotions to maintain an image of strength. He does not pretend indifference to keep power, and he does not withhold information to use later. His goodness leaves him completely vulnerable. Anyone can hurt him, manipulate him, take advantage of him. His trust is literal. He believes what he is told, interprets others' signals benevolently, and offers more than he receives. He does not build armor because his way of being in the world is precisely openness. This absolute vulnerability is dangerous in competitive systems. Normally, people learn to manage how much they show. There is a public side and a private side, opinions that are kept, feelings that are hidden. It is a form of self-defense. Myshkin, however, does not develop that filter. When something hurts him, it shows. When something moves him, it is noticeable. When he does not understand, he admits it. This transparency makes him seem less serious in the eyes of others, because in the culture of competition, a certain emotional toughness is expected. The one who leads does not cry, the one who negotiates does not get moved, the one who suffers does not show it. But it is precisely here that the central tension lies. The same quality that makes Myshkin profoundly human also makes him an easy target. The novel suggests that radical goodness is not only a virtue, but also a situation of risk in a hostile environment. It is no coincidence that it attracts both wounded and destructive characters. The former feel that finally someone sees them. The latter see an opportunity to dominate someone who will not defend himself with the usual weapons. In this context, the impossibility of translating compassion into exchange value appears. In many social spheres, even goodness can be transformed into capital. Doing charity brings prestige. Showing empathy improves one's image. Being a good person becomes a brand. Help is photographed, narrated, and incorporated into one's public narrative. It is a way to convert moral gestures into symbolic benefits. Myshkin does not enter into that logic. When he acts out of compassion, he does not think about how he will be perceived. He does not try to accumulate gratitude, build alliances, or construct a reputation of being a noble soul. That is why his actions seem, from the outside, unproductive. He helps those who will not recognize it, exposes himself for those who will betray him, intercedes for those who will continue to self-destruct. There is no return or clear lesson. It is compassion that does not generate credit. And since it does not translate into social capital, the environment does not know what to do with it. Some interpret it as weakness, others as a hidden strategy they do not yet understand. The idea that someone would help without seeking anything in return is, for many, simply unbelievable. In a society accustomed to measuring everything, Myshkin's compassion is a non-convertible gesture. It cannot be counted. It does not increase any balance. That is why it is scandalous. By contrast, it shows how calculated much of our moral life has become. When help is given expecting a thank you, a change in attitude, a future acknowledgement, disappointment is just around the corner. Myshkin, by expecting nothing, is not disappointed in this sense, but pays another price. He is left without tools to set boundaries, to protect himself, to say, this far, no further. Finally, this combination of sincerity, exposure, and non-exchangeable compassion makes Myshkin a presence that disrupts invisible hierarchies. In every human group, there are unwritten rules. Who can interrupt whom? Who can make jokes at whose expense? Who is admired? Who is despised? Who is the object of desire? And who is ridiculed? These hierarchies mark each person's place and are maintained through gestures, silences, and daily rituals. Myshkin, unwittingly, breaks these patterns. He treats with respect those who should be despised, shows solidarity with those everyone uses as targets, looks directly at those who are used to being feared. When the object of ridicule becomes a valid interlocutor, the hierarchy is strained. When the powerful are confronted gently but without fear, they lose part of their aura. When a woman marked by scandal is treated as someone worthy of love and not as damaged goods, the order of who is worthy and who is not is called into question. This disorganization is silent but deep. It does not consist of making speeches against injustice, but in acting as if these hierarchies were not natural. Myshkin does not organize a social revolution. He simply refuses to internalize who deserves what treatment, and that, in a world where stability depends on everyone accepting their place, is a threat. His mere presence, by redistributing attention, respect, and tenderness, alters the power dynamics. Social mechanisms of defense against purity. In Dostoevsky's logic, the first line of social defense is ridicule. When someone introduces a different logic, the most effective approach is not to refute it with arguments, but to turn it into an object of mockery. Myshkin is treated as a joke. His sincerity is exaggerated, his social awkwardness caricatured, and his acts of compassion are presented as comedic scenes. Making him appear ridiculous has a double effect. On one hand, it discredits him. If he is a fool, there is no need to take seriously what he says or does. On the other hand, it reassures others. If his way of living is the subject of laughter, no one needs to wonder if he might be pointing to something true about the moral misery of the group. This mechanism is easily recognizable today. Mockery is almost always directed at those who break implicit codes, those who take injustice seriously, those who do not accept cruel jokes, those who refuse to play along with permanent irony. Labels are attached, exaggerated, dramatic, moralistic, naive. The goal is not to debate what is being raised, but to put the person back in their place, the one who doesn't understand how the world works. Laughing at someone who does not adapt is a quick way to restore order without having to justify it. Thus, mockery functions as a pedagogy of cynicism. Every time someone expresses genuine compassion and is met with jokes, eye rolls, or sarcastic comments, the message to others is clear: don't be like him. One learns by observation that feeling too much, exposing oneself too much, or taking morality seriously comes with a social price. Many young characters in the novel grasp this lesson. They see that if they imitate Myshkin, they will end up isolated. If, on the other hand, they adopt an ironic tone, they will be accepted. The same thing happens in our families, schools, or workplaces. It is taught, without saying it, that the safest path is the mocking detachment. Cynicism is thus passed on, almost affectionately, as if it were maturity. "One day you will understand," is what is said to the one who is shocked by an injustice. Translated, one day you will stop suffering over this and learn to live like everyone else. In this sense, mockery educates. It teaches not to take one's own convictions too seriously, to relativize the pain of others, and not to get involved where it's not convenient. In contrast, Myshkin's persistence in feeling and acting without calculation becomes irritating, like a child who refuses to join the game but by doing so exposes its cruelty. Moral indignation is another, more sophisticated defense mechanism. When the presence of someone like Myshkin makes collective guilt evident, one way out is to direct that guilt outward. Instead of asking themselves, "What are we doing wrong?" the group looks for an object on which to discharge moral indignation. Another character, a scapegoat, an external scandal. Thus, the feeling of guilt becomes energy directed against someone else. The emotion seems just, but its function is to avoid self-examination. We can also observe this in the present. Public moral indignation often does not imply a genuine willingness to change anything. It works as a valve. Anger is displayed in extreme cases. The monster of the moment is condemned, and in doing so, one feels on the right side. Meanwhile, the small daily violences, of which one participates or at least tolerates, remain untouched. The figure of the idiot is uncomfortable, because he does not join in this choreography. He does not feel better for condemning others, but worse for what everyone shares. Another central component is resentment toward those who do not compete. In a system where the value of people is linked to their ability to win things like money, recognition, sexual partners, or even symbolic spaces like professional titles, those who choose not to compete or not to organize their life according to these criteria arouse particular irritation. Myshkin does not fight to occupy a place. He does not obsess over his honor. He does not calculate his prestige. That not only makes him odd, it also exposes the arbitrariness of the game in which the others are trapped. If someone can live without obsessing over winning, what does that say about those who dedicate all their energy to doing so? Resentment arises from that comparison. The characters who have defined themselves by their ambition, their pride, or their ability to maneuver feel, in the face of Myshkin, something more than disdain. They feel a kind of inverted envy. He seems free from the competitive anxiety that consumes them. But instead of recognizing that freedom as something valuable, they perceive it as a threat. It questions their sacrifices, their renunciations, their hardness. It is more comfortable to discredit the one who does not compete with phrases like, "he's useless," or "he doesn't know what he's doing," than to admit that perhaps there is another way to exist in the world. Finally, all of this is sustained by cynicism as a tacit survival pact. Cynicism here is not just about making dark jokes or distrusting everything. It is accepting as an unquestionable foundation that things are the way they are, that injustice is inevitable, that everyone is pursuing their own interest, that good intentions always fail. This pact frees us from the responsibility of trying to live in another way. If the world is essentially dirty, striving to be clean is an eccentricity. The reasonable thing is to learn to move within the dirt without getting too scandalized. In that context, the figure of Myshkin becomes intolerable because, through his way of being, he denies the main clause of the pact. He does not resign himself to the idea that evil has the last word in daily life. He doesn't preach it in speeches. He simply acts as if compassion is more real than calculation. This does not make the system collapse, but it does reveal it for what it is. And often, when a society sees itself too clearly, the reaction is not to change, but to eliminate or neutralize the gaze that made it possible. When someone acts well without asking for anything, especially in the face of a grave wrong, they leave the other person defenseless. The expected response would be, "I'll return the favor. I'll compensate for this. I'll meet you at your level." But Myshkin's goodness often reaches where there is no real possibility of balance, in front of people who feel tainted, unworthy, or who have already crossed boundaries they cannot undo. In these cases, goodness does not equalize. It emphasizes the distance. The forgiven one suddenly finds themselves in the position of a moral debtor, and that debt cannot be repaid. What could have been gratitude turns into resentment. The other feels exposed by that superiority that is not imposed but perceived. Hence, goodness can be experienced as a threat. Truly accepting someone like Myshkin's goodness means recognizing, "I have been cruel, he has not. I have lied, he has not. I have calculated, he has not." That recognition hurts the pride. Instead of being grateful, many characters react by attacking the source of that discomfort. It is easier to degrade the good person with ideas like, "He's sick," "He's a fool," or "He doesn't understand life," than to review one's own behavior. Hostility, then, works as a defense against shame. Against this background, the systematic exploitation of the naive becomes understandable. Once the group identifies someone as incapable of defending themselves, setting boundaries, or responding with violence, the possibility of using them opens up. In the novel, this is seen when people approach Myshkin to ask for money, understanding, emotional support, or an ever-present ear. Many approach him not so much for what he is, but for what he allows, unloading guilt, receiving relief, testing the limits of the patience of someone who will not seek revenge. This type of exploitation is usually not entirely conscious. It is not formulated in terms of, "I'm going to take advantage of him," but rather in a chain of small decisions. After all, he will understand. He won't take it badly. He's there for that. The unconditional availability of the kind-hearted person creates a kind of void in which others deposit their discomfort without considering the effect it has on him. In this way, goodness ends up being used as a resource, almost like a free containment service, without the group questioning how it wears him down. Something similar happens in everyday life. People who are especially empathetic, who listen, yield, forgive, and support others, often become the emotional center of their surroundings. Friendships, families, and work teams start revolving around their capacity to endure. Not always out of malice, but out of convenience. It is easier to lean on someone who never says no than to review one's own way of relating. The exploitation of the naive is not only economic or practical, it is, above all, emotional. When the exploited person does not react with harshness, another mechanism comes into play: contempt toward those who do not learn to toughen up. In the universe of the idiot, the ability to endure and toughen up is valued as a sign of maturity. Those who suffer and continue trusting are seen as childish. Myshkin does not become cynical despite betrayals. He does not adopt the language of hatred even when wounded. And precisely for that reason, instead of being admired, he becomes someone who never grows up, who doesn't understand how things work. This contempt has a perverse logic. Those who have hardened through blows justify their own armor by disqualifying those who do not build one. To think that Myshkin's vulnerability is valuable would mean admitting that the learning based on toughening up might have been a defeat, not a triumph. It is less painful to interpret one's own insensitivity as wisdom and others' sensitivity as stupidity. Thus, the circle closes. The victim of exploitation is guilty for not learning. In our society, a version of this argument is often heard. If you don't protect yourself, they will walk all over you. If you don't respond the same way, they will take advantage of you. There is real experience behind these phrases, but also a resignation. It is assumed that there is no other way to live than by accepting toughness as the only defense. In the face of this, someone who refuses to toughen up does not fit in. They become an uncomfortable reminder of a possibility that others have abandoned, and for that reason an object of contempt. Ultimately, this entire process is legitimized through what we could call moral violence as an acceptable form of exclusion. It is not always possible to expel someone openly from a group. That would be too obvious. But moral judgments can be used to isolate them. They are attributed a character flaw, their motives are questioned, and they are presented as a problem. This label justifies taking distance without feeling cruel. In The Idiot, this moral violence is expressed in comments, glances, informal diagnoses. Myshkin becomes the subject of analysis rather than dialogue. People speak about him, they opine on his mental state, and decide what place he can or cannot occupy. He is not physically struck. He is defined in such a way that any harm he receives seems inevitable or even correct. If someone suffers because of his goodness, it is concluded that he brought it upon himself. Thus, responsibility is inverted. The environment doesn't have to reconsider how it treats him. He must stop being who he is. Historical context: a society in moral decay. Myshkin did not fall from the sky in front of Dostoevsky as an abstract idea of goodness, but was born within a very specific historical crisis. If we take him out of that 19th century Russia and place him in a timeless moral vacuum, we lose half the meaning of the novel. Dostoevsky is not conducting a laboratory experiment with a generic good man. He is asking what happens when a figure of radical compassion bursts into a society undergoing a traumatic transition, from the old, religious and hierarchical order to a modern, utilitarian and disenchanted world. Russia at that time was a country split between two eras. On one hand, there was still Tsarism, the peasant structure, hereditary nobility, and the Orthodox Church as a symbolic framework. On the other hand, European ideas such as rationalism, science, socialism, liberalism, and above all, financial capitalism were beginning to emerge. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 shook the economic and social foundations. Cities grew, new middle classes and new bureaucracies appeared. None of this settled calmly. It was a change experienced as a tear, not as an ordered evolution. In this context, a figure like Myshkin was not only different, he was a kind of test for a society that didn't know whether to remain what it was or to become something else. The aristocracy, which had been the axis of social and political life, fell into decline. Many noble families lost their economic base when they could no longer exploit the free labor of peasants. Others began to incur debt, surviving only on appearances. They continued to organize salons, dinners, parties, and matrimonial arrangements, but their moral authority was empty. The theater of manners, titles, and protocols no longer convinced anyone, not even themselves. The characters in The Idiot who belong to that world, such as retired generals, society ladies, and idle young men, live in a space where appearances matter more than convictions. In this environment, Myshkin arrives as a foreign body. He does not navigate the aristocratic codes. He does not know when to remain silent, when to exaggerate politeness, or when to pretend not to have seen something. The decadent nobility feels both fascinated and threatened. On one hand, his naive goodness seems entertaining, refreshing to them. On the other, his way of telling the truth without malice exposes the falseness of many of their poses. He does not rise up against them with political speeches, but simply by being who he is, he shows that their social elegance lacks real moral substance. This is why they accept him as a curiosity, but they cannot take him as a model. At the same time, the old traditional religious sense is beginning to crumble. The Orthodox faith no longer structures the life of the elite in the same way as before. Many continue to practice rituals, celebrate festivals, repeat formulas, but the core of religious experience, trust in a transcendent meaning, in a God who gives direction to suffering, is weakened. In the face of this emptiness, two paths open, one for those who turn religion into cultural decoration, and another for those who reject it outright, embracing atheistic or indifferent positions. Dostoevsky places Myshkin precisely at the point where this break becomes evident. His faith is neither folklore nor ideology. It is a living relationship with what he perceives as a presence of love and mercy. When he speaks of Christ, he does not do so as a theologian, but as someone who sees in this figure the model of a humanity that does not renounce compassion. But this religiosity no longer finds a common language in his surroundings. Some perceive it as soft fanaticism, others as simple illness, others as something of a childish soul. The rupture of traditional religious meaning causes a lived faith, instead of being the shared center, to become a marginal rarity. At the other extreme, figures like Ippolit appear, expressing desperate nihilism. Nihilism, in simple terms, is the position that asserts there are no absolute values, no ultimate meaning, no religious or moral foundation that compels. The only solid thing is blind nature, matter, suffering without redemption. From there, one can derive an ethic of survival or pleasure or radical pessimism. In Russia, nihilism blended with social and political critiques, distrust of the state, the church, the family, anyone who claimed to represent a higher order. Alongside nihilism, a type of moral utilitarianism grows. What is good is what produces measurable results, and what is bad is what hinders them. The question is no longer what is just, but what works. Effective action is valued over loyalty to principles. Calculation replaces conscience. In this climate, sacrificing some in the name of a better future seems acceptable. Manipulating or lying can be justified by their supposed positive effects. Characters who think in terms of what is convenient embody this spirit. They judge Myshkin not by asking whether he is right, but whether he is useful. The tension between this nihilism/utilitarianism and the figure of the prince is central. Myshkin does not deny suffering. He does not sugarcoat it. He has known illness, poverty, humiliation, and knows that life can be brutal. But his response is not to say, nothing makes sense, nor everything boils down to material interests. Right in the middle of a culture that oscillates between meaninglessness and the cult of utility, he insists that a person's worth cannot be measured by their function, and that compassion takes precedence over calculation. This is why his presence seems so anachronistic. His ethics sound old-fashioned and at the same time more radical than any modern ideology. Myshkin is a product of that historical crisis because only in a broken world like mid-century Russia could he appear as he does, too late to be understood by the old order, too early to be welcomed by a truly humane new order that does not yet exist. The decadent nobles see him as a social accident, the nihilists see him as a relic, the utilitarians see him as useless. Each group projects its own crisis onto him. His mere existence exhibits the exhaustion of old legitimacies and the insufficiency of new ones. If we think of it this way, the idiot stops being an isolated symbol of goodness and becomes a limiting case of the era, an extreme experiment that shows the state of a society in transition, a community that still speaks the language of morality and religion, but which in practice is guided by interest and disenchantment, does not know what to do with someone who takes seriously what it itself now only utters insincerely. This is why, more than an abstract moral hero, Myshkin is a living X-ray of the Russian crisis of the 19th century, and through it an uncomfortable mirror of all societies that claim to value goodness while expelling it when it stops being decorative. So far, we have seen Myshkin clash with individuals and concrete situations. But his loneliness is not explained solely by bad people or psychological chance. It is the symptom of something deeper, an individual isolated amid institutions that have lost their moral content. The family, the aristocracy, the church in the background, justice, medicine, everything exists, everything has a name and form, but almost nothing truly sustains people's lives. In that landscape, Myshkin's goodness finds no foundation. An institution, in its basic sense, is a framework that organizes experience. It tells who is who, what is allowed, how conflicts are resolved, what it means to live well. The family should protect, the church should guide, the law should correct, the state should ensure justice, and culture should offer models of meaning. In Dostoevsky's universe, as described by Guardini, this everyday network of work, norms, and customs that provides security appears weakened. The characters are exposed, just like that, to fate, to moral and religious forces without mediation. This brutal exposure is clearly seen in The Idiot. When someone falls, there is almost no institution to contain them. Aristocratic salons are an example. Formally, they are spaces of polite sociability, where codes of honor and courtesy are supposed to prevail. In practice, they are stages of gossip, intrigue, and elegant humiliation. There is no true moral standard there, only a game of appearances. The family, far from being a refuge, is a field of pressure, marital calculations, and prestige. The legal system exists, but it does not stop abuses that everyone knows about. Medicine soothes bodies but does not understand souls. Myshkin moves through all these spheres as someone who brings an intense ethics to a world where the structures that should embody it are empty. This sense of institutional emptiness is the concrete manifestation of something broader, the failure of the great moral narratives. A great narrative is a shared story that attempts to answer three questions: who are we, what is good, and where are we going as a community? Traditional Christianity, the idea of aristocratic honor, faith in rational progress, or social revolution are examples of great narratives. They organize life, justify sacrifice, and allow for the interpretation of suffering. In The Idiot, these narratives are in crisis. Many characters continue to use Christian language, but they do not live according to it. Honor is invoked while intrigue and humiliation are practiced. Europe and its progress are admired, but without true confidence in reason. Modern ideas are flirted with, but their consequences are not fully embraced. No one believes entirely, no one stops believing entirely. The result is a kind of moral no man's land. Too much lucidity to naively uphold the old order, too much distrust to build a new one. Myshkin enters the scene with a different narrative. He concretely believes in the dignity of every person and in a mercy that is worth more than success. He does not articulate it as a system, he embodies it, and that further exposes the failure of the surrounding narratives. Not because he combats them with theories, but because he exposes them by contrast. His compassion reveals that the social Christianity around him is decorative. His inability to participate in the game of honor shows that this honor is a mask. His resistance to cynicism makes it clear that the narrative of progress coexists with a deep moral violence. Dostoevsky writes this not as an academic observing from the outside, but as a witness and victim of the spiritual collapse of his time. He was arrested for participating in political critique circles, was on the verge of execution before a firing squad, spent years in Siberian prisons, lived among criminals, experienced extreme poverty, compulsive gambling and illness. He lived in his body and his biography the destruction of political, philosophical, and religious certainties. He does not describe the loss of meaning, he suffers it, endures it, and tries to respond to it through his work. In Dostoevsky's world, everything is permeated by a radical religious problem. People, their actions, their relationships, their sufferings, no longer rest on a normal life protected by stable institutions, but on a field of extreme forces where evil, grace, despair, and faith occur directly. This lack of intermediate support explains why his characters always seem on the edge of the abyss. There is no custom, law, or structure to cushion their inner crises. In this context, the figure of the idiot takes on another meaning. Myshkin is not just a good man in a bad world. He is a desperate attempt to imagine what would remain of Christian goodness in a society where doctrine no longer convinces, the institutional church has lost authority, and inherited morality no longer truly orders life. This is why his goodness appears unprotected, ineffective, almost tragic. No institution translates it into social order, no framework recognizes it as a criterion. It is a light that finds no architectural support. This situation leads us to the final point, the historical impossibility of purity in times of transition. Purity, here, does not mean perfection without sin, but deep coherence between what is believed and what is lived, between what is considered good and the structures that would allow it to be practiced. In relatively stable societies, this coherence is difficult, but at least there is continuity between convictions and ways of life. In times of the collapse of narratives and institutions, any attempt at purity faces a problem. There is no place for it to incarnate without distorting itself. That is exactly what happens to Myshkin. He wants to love without using, forgive without humiliating, tell the truth without destroying, but he moves within a network of relationships organized by interest, pride, resentment, and calculation. Every gesture of his, no matter how pure in intent, becomes part of a dirty fabric. It awakens jealousy, reopens wounds, disorients hierarchies, triggers resentments. His purity cannot be realized without producing effects that contradict its purpose. When he tries to save Nastasia, he ends up trapped in a dynamic that pushes her toward self-destruction. When he tries to be just with Aglaya, he fuels confusion and resentments. Not because he wants this, but because the context inevitably contaminates his actions. The novel thus suggests that in times of historical transition, isolated goodness is tragic. It sees more than most, desires more than the structures can bear, but lacks the means to transform the whole. It is not enough for there to be a more lucid or more compassionate individual. If institutions are emptied of moral content, their effort becomes almost useless heroism. Myshkin does not fail because he is too good in a naive sense, but because he is alone in front of a world where the old forms no longer make way for the sacred, and the new forms have not yet been born. For the contemporary reader, this is a clear warning. Often, individual solutions to structural problems are relied upon. If there were more good people, if everyone did their part. The Idiot nuances this hope. It shows an extreme case in which the presence of someone extraordinarily good is not enough to reverse a widespread spiritual and moral collapse. People who try to live with integrity in decayed systems may end up, like Myshkin, isolated, used, ill, or broken, not because their integrity is a mistake, but because they find no structures to embrace it. Dostoevsky does not offer a simple escape. He does not propose a political program or an idealized restoration of the past. What he does is place the reader before an uncomfortable question. What can we expect from goodness when institutions lose their soul and the great moral narratives no longer guide life? Prince Myshkin is the answer in the form of a tragic parable. An idiot who does not adapt to the cynicism necessary for survival and who, for that very reason, reveals the depth of the collapse. The necessary failure. Why the idiot cannot survive. The destruction of the idiot is not an accident of the plot nor a tragic whim of the author. It is the logical conclusion of everything we have seen, of a social structure that only works if it neutralizes that which it cannot integrate or exploit. If we follow Myshkin's journey, we do not find a great heroic climax in the classical sense, where the protagonist sacrifices himself in a decisive moment and leaves the world transformed. What we see is something more subtle, and for that reason more disturbing. A slow, cumulative fall, made up of small wounds, misunderstandings, abuses, and emotional overloads that ultimately overwhelm him. Myshkin's initial fragility, that is, his illness, his hypersensitivity, and his inability to protect himself, does not destroy him on its own. What breaks him is the entire environment acting upon these cracks. Every conflict in which he tries to mediate, every other's suffering he absorbs, every moral violence he witnesses and cannot process, adds up as an additional layer of weight. There is not a single moment in which he loses the battle. Rather, there is a series of chain impacts that gradually wear him down. His fall is not that of a hero who dies in a decisive gesture, but that of an organism that cannot withstand the accumulation of toxins that society injects into him. The central mechanism of this wear and tear is the absorption of others' suffering. Myshkin does not only see the pain of others, he lets it in. He lets it pass through his own body and mind. He tries to hold the despair of Ippolit, Nastasia's self-destruction, Aglaya's wounded pride, Rogojin's inner violence, the hypocrisy of the salons, the humiliation of the humiliated. He is like a moral sponge. Everything the system refuses to feel, he absorbs. This function is not recognized nor supported by anyone. It is an invisible burden. And in such a context, the invisible is not compensated for. It is exploited until it breaks. When this burden becomes unbearable, the only exit the world of the novel offers is madness. Not so much as a medical diagnosis, but as the ultimate form of social expulsion. Madness marks the moment when society can say, he is no longer one of us. What happens to him is no longer our problem. The final Myshkin, undone, disconnected, almost returned to a state prior to speech, fulfills that function. He is the repository where everything that was not consciously processed ends up. Madness takes away the voice of the one who said what no one wanted to hear. Declaring him ill has a moral advantage for others. It frees the community from having to review its responsibility in his destruction. If Myshkin's end is simply the fate of an epileptic with mental issues, then no one has to ask themselves what role mockery, abuse, cynicism, and the lack of real support played in that outcome. The psychiatric label stabilizes the guilt. The problem was in him, not in us. Madness here is not just a mental state. It is a collective excuse. In this sense, Myshkin's goodness does not transform the world. It does not reform institutions, does not create a new way of living together, does not open a historical path. The system around him remains what it was. competitive, cynical, fragmented, unable to sustain radical compassion. However, that goodness does reveal the world with a clarity that we otherwise would not have. It is not enough to change it, but it illuminates it. After seeing how each character reacts to Myshkin, we can no longer deceive ourselves about their deep motivations. The novel does not offer us an exit, but it removes the comfort of ignorance. This brings us to a hard idea, the impossibility of collective redemption in the universe Dostoevsky constructs here. There is no moment when the entire community stops, recognizes the value of the idiot, and changes its way of living. There is no widespread conversion, no historical learning, no shared moral shift. There are, at most, individual flashes of guilt, remorse, intuitions that something irreparable has been done. But those sparks do not add up to a new common light. They remain isolated, like late regrets. The logic that dominates is different. The world does not learn. It just eliminates anomalies. Every time someone appears who embodies a different logic, such as not hierarchizing pain, not reducing the other to a function, or not accepting cynicism as the norm, the system readjusts to expel or neutralize them. It can do so by ridicule, by isolation, by exploitation until exhaustion, or finally by labeling them as crazy. The concrete form matters less than the result. To restore the initial balance, where competition, pride, and utility become the dominant criteria again. In that framework, Myshkin is not just an individual victim, he is a symptom of the failure of humanity as a whole. His destruction speaks not only of the cruelty of certain people, but of an entire culture's inability to make real space for compassion without calculation. The idiot points out the gap between what we claim to value and what we actually reward and protect. Cunning, toughness, the ability to use others without collapsing. His fate functions as an X-ray. It shows that the distance between moral discourse and social practice is not a correctable detail, but a structural crack. The final warning of the novel, therefore, is not directed against goodness. It does not tell us, don't be like Myshkin, because the world will destroy you. That would be a conformist reading, taking the character's defeat as a lesson to adapt to the system. What is being pointed out is something more unsettling. A society that only tolerates the calculable is fundamentally ill. If the only thing considered reasonable is what can be measured in benefits, efficiencies, and results, any gesture that does not fit into that accounting will appear as madness, uselessness, or danger. The point is not to abandon goodness in order to survive, but to ask what it means to live in a world where radical goodness, instead of awakening recognition, generates hostility and destruction. The figure of Myshkin forces us to look in the mirror. What do we do in our daily lives with people who embody something similar? Do we use them, ridicule them, exhaust them, make them feel out of place? Or are we capable of letting their anomaly question us, even though it destabilizes us? The idiot offers no reassuring answers. It does not promise that if there were more Myshkins, the world would fix itself. But it also does not invite us to resign ourselves to cynicism. What it does is show, with painful clarity, the human cost of a society that has learned to live with almost any form of evil, but cannot tolerate an extreme form of good that it cannot exploit. That is the real threat running through the novel, not that idiots like Myshkin exist, but that there is less and less room for them. And in that loss, what is at stake is not the fate of an individual, but the limit of what we are still willing to consider human.